Welcome back to Irons Through the Ages. Last week we saw West Ham United born, kitted out in claret and blue, and settled into Upton Park. We followed Sid King through the Southern League years and heard the West Ham pals shout, "Up the Hammers" in France. By the end of episode 2, it was 1919. The war was over. West Ham United had just been elected to the Football League Second Division for the first time. The national stage was theirs at last. Today we cover the 1920s, and what a decade it was. There's a promotion, there's a cup run, there's a brand new stadium called Wembley, there's a crowd so enormous it spilled onto the pitch, and there's a grey horse. Everybody calls him White, but he was grey, named Billy. This is episode 3, the White Horse Final. On the 30th of August, 1919, West Ham United ran out at the Berlin ground for a Football League Second Division fixture against Lincoln City. It was the first league match in the club's history, 24 years after Thames Ironworks FC had kicked a ball on a rough pitch in Canning Town, and 19 years after the club had reformed as West Ham United and set its sights on the Football League. The match ended 1-1, with West Ham's goal scored by a player named James Moyes. It was a modest result, but momentous. This wasn't the Southern League. This was the Football League, the real thing. Those first Football League seasons were a period of adjustment. The second division was harder, the opposition stronger, and West Ham spent the first few years finding their feet with mid-table finishes. But Sid King was not standing still. He was building, and the player he built around, the man who would become the heartbeat of everything that followed, arrived in February 1920 from a club in Northamptonshire for the modest fee of 50. His name was Vic Watson, and he would become the greatest goalscorer in West Ham United's history. Through the early 1920s, West Ham began to find their stride in the Football League. The football was good. King had assembled a side that played with intelligence and width, a passing team that liked to use the flanks and create chances through combination play rather than brute force. It was, in many ways, the template for what West Ham football would become known for across the generations. By the 1922-23 season, the club was in real contention for promotion to the First Division. The squad that would carry them through that extraordinary double-headed season was beginning to take shape. Watson up front, Jimmy Ruffell flying down the left wing, Big Ted Houghton commanding the goal, and Captain George Kay marshalling the defence. And then came the FA Cup. Before we get to Wembley, it's worth spending a few minutes with the players who got West Ham there, because this was a genuinely good football team, not a lucky team, not a team that stumbled into a cup final, but a well-organised, well-coached side that had earned every step of its journey. Goalkeeper Ted Houghton was a big, commanding presence. He won 6 England caps and was dependable, brave, and essential to the team. Captain George Kay, the right half, was Sid King's organiser on the pitch. He understood the game deeply, led by example, and held the team together. In 1923, he was West Ham through and through. And then there was Jimmy Ruffell. Born in Doncaster, raised in Manor Park, signed by West Ham in 1920, Ruffell was the flying outside left who made the whole thing tick. He was phenomenally quick, with the kind of pace that made fullbacks look foolish and created space for Watson through the middle. He would go on to make 548 appearances for West Ham, still 6th on the all-time list, and score 166 goals from a wide position. 6 England caps, which frankly should have been many more. Ruffell later recalled the kind of football they played during those years, and his words are worth quoting directly. He said, "West Ham were a good passing team. Most of the time you had an idea where men were, or men would make themselves ready to get the ball from another player. I think we were one of the few clubs to really practice that. Practice, deliberate, intentional. A passing game built on the training ground rather than instinct alone. In 1923, that was quietly revolutionary, and it was 50 years before Ron Greenwood would get the credit for inventing it. And then there was Vic Watson. Watson had arrived to replace Sid Pudderfoot and immediately justified the decision. He wasn't just a goal hanger, he was a creator who held the forward line together with unselfish distribution and intelligent movement. He was a creator as much as a finisher, and one of the finest the game had seen. West Ham's route to the 1923 FA Cup final was built on a combination of clinical efficiency and good fortune with the draw. They faced second division opposition or lower in every single round, the first time that had happened since the introduction of multiple divisions. Nobody could accuse them of having an easy ride exactly, but equally they hadn't been required to knock out a first division giant on the way. The fourth round against Southampton took 3 attempts, 3 games before West Ham finally put Southampton away. It was the kind of cup tie that turns supporters into nervous wrecks and managers into insomniacs. But they got through it. The semi-final against Derby County, who were in the first division, was a different matter. West Ham were magnificent. They scored 5 goals. Derby was swept aside, and suddenly, improbably, the second division side from East London were in the FA Cup final. The final would be played at a brand new stadium, one that had never hosted a match before, one that had been built with scale and spectacle in mind, and would go on to become the most famous football ground in the world. Wembley. Wembley Stadium, officially the Empire Stadium, had been built in just 300 days as the centrepiece of the British Empire exhibition. It cost £750,000. It had a capacity of 127,000. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary building. Twin towers rising above the North London skyline, a great bowl of terracing and stands that was intended to hold the biggest sporting occasions in the land. On the morning of Saturday, the 28th of April, 1923, people began making their way toward it from very early. There were no ticket restrictions in the modern sense for most of the ground. You paid at the turnstile, and you went in. And the people of London, football, mad, in the way that only a city that has just endured a world war and is desperate for celebration can be, came in their tens of thousands. The official capacity was 127,000. The official attendance was recorded as 126,047. But those numbers tell only a fraction of the story. The actual crowd that day, accounting for those who had climbed walls, forced turnstiles, slipped through gates, or simply pushed through in the crush, was estimated by police at between 150,000 and 300,000 people. The most commonly cited figure is around 200,000. But some who were there that day believed there were more. Think about that. 200,000 people, or more, in a stadium built for 127,000, and more arriving all the time. By early afternoon, the situation had become critical. Barriers around the perimeter of the pitch collapsed under the weight of the crowd. Thousands of spectators, not hooligans, not troublemakers, just ordinary football fans who could no longer stand in the terraces because there was no room, spilled out onto the playing surface itself. The pitch disappeared under a sea of people, not dozens of people, not hundreds, tens of thousands of people, standing on the grass, stretching from touchline to touchline, goal to goal. The match, scheduled for 3 o'clock, seemed impossible. How could you play football on a pitch that had no visible grass? One spectator who was there that day summed it up with typically British understatement. He said later, "To put it mildly, the whole thing was a bloody shambles. The Bolton players had to abandon their coach a mile away from the stadium because the roads were impassable. They made their way through the crowd on foot. Then there was the small matter of finding a pitch to play on. Into this chaos rode a policeman named George Scorey, mounted on a grey horse named Billy. Billy, and let's address this now because it matters, was not white. The famous photographs of the day, taken in black and white, make him appear white against the dark mass of the crowd. But Billy was grey. A light grey, it's true, almost white in certain lights. But grey nonetheless. George Scorey himself confirmed this, none of which diminishes the story in the slightest. George Scorey was a former cavalry soldier. He'd served in the Boer War, played the trumpet in the Royal Scots Greys. He knew horses, he knew crowds, and on this April afternoon, he and Billy became the symbol of one of the most extraordinary days in English football history. Scorey and 9 other mounted officers moved slowly into the crowd on the pitch, step by step, gently but persistently pushing the mass of people back toward the touchlines. It was not a charge, it was a patient, meticulous process. Billy's grey flank nudging thousands of people back, inch by inch, until enough of the playing surface was clear to make a match possible. It took about 30 minutes. When King George V arrived at the royal box to watch, the crowd erupted into a spontaneous chorus of "God Save the King," And in that moment, something shifted. The mood changed. The crowd began, almost of its own accord, to help the police clear the pitch. Order emerged, slowly, improbably, from chaos. The match began 45 minutes late, and around the perimeter of the pitch, thousands of people stood, not in the stands, not behind barriers, but literally at the touchline, sometimes over it. The players could not stop near the line without running into the crowd. In the second half, play was stopped multiple times as spectators spilled back onto the field. The entire day was, as one contemporary account put it, simultaneously the most chaotic and most good-natured sporting occasion England had ever witnessed. Bolton Wanderers were the opponents. They were a first division side, a level above West Ham in the football pyramid, and they had arrived at the final having won every single round by exactly 1 goal. David Jack had scored the lone goal in every game from the 3rd round onwards. Bolton were disciplined, organised, and very hard to beat. West Ham had been talking about this match for days. Sid King had even made a radio broadcast in the week before the final, one of the very first ever made by a football manager, in which he observed that the size and quality of the Wembley pitch suited his side's fast wing play and passing style. He was optimistic. He had reason to be. The match itself was 2 minutes old when it fell apart. David Jack, of course it was David Jack, collected a pass and drove it past Ted Houghton. 1-0 to Bolton, 2 minutes in. The West Ham crowd groaned. The game had barely started. To their credit, West Ham didn't collapse and created chances. But the pitch, churned up by the crowd and horses' hooves, was ruinous to their wide, flowing football. Jimmy Ruffell later recalled they couldn't play on the wings because the crowd was right up to the line. And crucially, Bolton had to play on the same field, of course, but they didn't play so wide as West Ham. That was it. That was the match, in a sentence. West Ham's system depended on the wings. The wings didn't exist that day, literally swallowed by the crowd. Bolton's more central, direct style was less affected. West Ham's trainer Charlie Painter said afterwards, "It was that white horse thumping its big feet into the pitch that made it hopeless." In the 53rd odd minute, Jack Smith scored a second for Bolton, volleying in from Ted Vizard's cross. West Ham protested furiously that the ball had struck the post and been kicked in by a Bolton supporter standing at the side of the pitch. The referee, a man named Assen, was unmoved. 2-0 Bolton. Late in the game, West Ham captain George Kay tried to persuade the referee to abandon the match entirely. Bolton captain Joe Smith replied, with the composure of a man whose side is winning, "We're doing fine, ref. We'll play until dark to finish the match if necessary." The final whistle came. Bolton 2, West Ham 0. The FA Cup went north. While losing hurt, West Ham went home with the honour of having been part of an iconic day at the beginning of Wembley's history. One final detail about the White Horse final that I find irresistible. After the match, George Scorey was rewarded with free FA Cup final tickets for life. Ironically, he never used them, as the man famous for saving the final had absolutely no interest in football. Billy the Grey Horse died in 1930, and an inkwell was made from one of his hooves, which now sits in a police museum. And in 2005, the new footbridge near the rebuilt Wembley was named the White Horse Bridge, in honour of Billy the Grey Horse. Football. You really can't make it up. Here is the thing about the 1922-23 season that tends to get lost in the romance of the White Horse final. West Ham United were not just a cup team. They were a promotion-chasing side in the 2nd Division, and 2 days after losing the FA Cup final at Wembley, 2 days, they had to play a league match. The 30th of April, 1923. 48 hours after Billy the Grey Horse was doing his best to clear 200,000 people off a football pitch. 48 hours after the final whistle at the most chaotic match in English football history. West Ham United had to travel to Sheffield Wednesday's Hillsborough for a league match that they could not afford to lose. They won 2-0. Goals from Vic Watson and Billy Moore. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. The resilience of that group of players, physically and mentally, is almost impossible to fathom. They had just played the biggest match in the club's history, in front of the biggest crowd any of them would ever see, on a ruined pitch, in chaotic conditions, and lost. Then they got on a train to Sheffield and won a critical promotion match. That wasn't the end of the drama. Going into the final day of the season, West Ham were top of the table on goal average, but Leicester City and Notts County had the same number of points. Only the top two went up. If West Ham lost their last game, they might not go up at all. Their final fixture was at home. The opponents were Notts County, one of their direct promotion rivals. Over 26,000 people packed into Upton Park on the 5th of May, 1923. The atmosphere was intense, more nervy than celebratory, more desperate than triumphant. This was everything, right here, the Football League First Division, the top flight, the place the club had been building toward since the day Arnold Hills let Dave Taylor form a football team in a shipyard. Disaster struck almost immediately. In the 38th minute, Notts County scored. They were losing at home to their promotion rivals. In the match they had to win or draw. The crowd was silent. Upton Park held its breath. What happened next tells you everything about that West Ham side. They did not panic. They did not collapse. They played their football. The passing game, the wide game, the patient, intelligent game that Sid King and Charlie Painter had spent years building. The equaliser came, and then, with the crowd roaring, the winner. West Ham United 2, Notts County 1. When the other results came in, Leicester and Bury had drawn. West Ham were promoted to the First Division as runners-up to Notts County. FA Cup finalists and promoted to the First Division in the same season as a Second Division club. It remains a remarkable achievement, often overshadowed by the White Horse final. Sid King had done it. 30 years of work from that very first afternoon at Thames Ironworks had finally produced this. West Ham United were in the First Division, the big time, and they'd sung their way there. This episode covers the 1920s, and there is one thing that happened in the 1920s that we cannot pass over, because it's still happening today at every single West Ham home match, and has been for the best part of a century. Somewhere in the mid-1920s, the supporters of West Ham United adopted a song as their anthem. Not a rousing war hymn, not a chant about their players or their club. An American jazz waltz from 1918, originally written for a Broadway musical called The Passing Show of 1918. A song called I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles. How? Why? The honest answer is, nobody knows for certain. The origins are disputed and probably unresolvable, but the most widely told version of the story is this. In the early 1920s, schoolboy football was enormously popular in East London, and Upton Park often hosted matches for teams like Park School. Park School had a star player, Billy J. Murray, who had a striking resemblance to a famous image of the time. In 1886, the painter John Everett Millais painted a portrait of his grandson blowing a bubble. The painting, called Bubbles, was later used in a famous Piers soap ad. Billy Murray, apparently, looked very much like that boy, and so he was nicknamed Bubbles. The headmaster of Park School, Cornelius Beale, was a close friend of West Ham's trainer. When his team played well, he would sing I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles in honour of his star player, Bubbles Murray. Through the connection between Beale and Painter, the song made its way to Upton Park. The Beckton Gas Works Band, who were engaged to play before kick-off and at half-time, began playing it. The crowd began singing along. And in the way that these things happen, gradually, then, all at once, it became the song of West Ham United. Whether that's exactly how it happened is genuinely uncertain. Billy Murray never played for the first team, and some historians argue the timeline doesn't work. The first documented evidence of West Ham supporters singing it isn't until 1940, so the true origin may be lost. But here is what we do know. Sometime in the 1920s, West Ham United acquired one of the most distinctive pre-match traditions in football. A song about dreams and impermanence and hope. They fly so high, nearly reach the sky, then like my dreams they fade and die. Became the soundtrack to a club that had always been about aspiration as much as achievement. The team from the shipyard, the club from the streets. Forever blowing bubbles, pretty bubbles in the air. It fits. It fits so well that even now, 100 years later, it stops you in your tracks when you hear it. The bubbles rising from the pitch, the entire stadium singing together. the claret and blue streaming from the stands. That's West Ham. That always was West Ham. And it started, somehow, in a schoolyard in East London, because a boy who looked like a soap advert had a headmaster who liked to sing. For this episode, the 1920s, the player I want to spotlight is one of the greatest West Ham United have ever produced. A man who arrived almost unnoticed and left as the most prolific goalscorer in the club's history. Vic Watson was born in Girton, Cambridgeshire, in 1897. He grew up in the village of Wellingborough and played for local clubs before West Ham paid £50 for him in February 1920. £50. For a man who would go on to score 326 goals in 505 appearances, a record that still stands today and will almost certainly stand forever. Watson was not an imposing physical specimen, not a target man who bullied defenders or won everything in the air. He was clever, quick, blessed with the kind of goal-scoring instinct that cannot be taught, only discovered. He could shoot with both feet. He could drift into space. He could hold the ball up, bring teammates into play, and then vanish into a pocket and arrive on the end of a cross a fraction of a second before the defender got there. The peak of his West Ham career came in the 1929-30 season. He scored 50 goals in 44 games, 50 goals. That included hat-tricks against Aston Villa, home and away, and scoring all 4 goals in a FA Cup win over Leeds United. That season, he was the First Division's leading scorer. He was recalled to the England squad and scored twice in a 5-2 victory over Scotland. 6 goals against Leeds United in a single game in February 1929. 50 goals in a single season, a total of 32-6, more than Geoff Hurst, more than Jimmy Ruffell, more than any West Ham player who has ever lived. And yet Vic Watson is not a household name beyond West Ham supporters. He has none of the cultural presence of the players we'll discuss in later episodes. He never won a major trophy with West Ham. He never played in a World Cup. He scored his goals quietly, relentlessly, week after week, for a club that was almost always fighting to hold its own in the top flight, rather than challenging for titles. That feels like the right story for this era. A man who gave everything to his club, who was extraordinary by any measure, and who history has been slightly unkind to. Very West Ham, very East London. For this episode's fan's eye view, I want to go back to Jimmy Ruffell. Because Ruffell was one of those rare footballers who was also a good talker, a man who could articulate what things felt and looked like from the inside, and who gave a number of interviews in later life that bring the era alive in a way that statistics simply cannot. This is Ruffell, recalling what it was like to walk out at Wembley on the day of the 1923 FA Cup final. Most of the people at Wembley seemed to be Londoners. Well, the ones I saw seemed to be. As we tried to make our way out onto the field, everyone was slapping us on the back and grabbing our hands to shake them. By the time I got to the centre of the pitch, my poor shoulder was aching. Think about what he's describing there. The players walking through the crowd to get to the pitch. Not through a tunnel, not down a corridor. Through the crowd. Tens of thousands of people standing on the grass, reaching out to touch the West Ham players as they passed through them. The shoulder aching from the handshakes. That's the scale of it. That's the intimacy of it. He then described the game itself. It was a hard game for West Ham to play, as the field had been churned up so bad by horses and the crowd that had been on the pitch well before the game. West Ham made a lot of the wings, and you just couldn't run them for the crowd that were right up close to the line. And there it is, the moment where everything that was brilliant about that West Ham team, everything Sid King had built and Jimmy Ruffell had embodied, collided with something completely outside anyone's control. The pitch, the crowd, the chaos. 2 days later, Ruffell and his teammates were on a train to Sheffield, and they won. That, in a nutshell, is the spirit of West Ham United in the 1920s. And, if we're being honest, in every decade that followed. The 1920s, a decade of firsts for West Ham United. The first Football League season, the first FA Cup final, the first Wembley, the first time 200,000 people watched a football match at one venue, and the first notes of "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles" drifting across Upton Park on a Saturday afternoon. They didn't win the FA Cup. They never quite challenged for the First Division title, finishing most seasons comfortably in mid-table, But they were there, in the top flight, in the national conversation. A proper, established First Division football club. 9 seasons in the top flight between 1923 and 1932. From a shipyard in Canning Town to the Empire Stadium at Wembley in just 28 years. Next week, on episode 4, the 1930s and the shadow that fell over everything. A relegation, a sacking, the tragic end of Sid King's extraordinary tenure, and a club that had to find out, all over again, who it was. Until then, thank you for listening. Come on, you Irons.